In this video article, we're going to look at Brandon Sanderson's outline backwards, write forwards concept and see if it works for short stories. Before we get started, if you want to get an email with a timestamped overview every time I release a new video, head over to my website, deliberate-practice.com, sign up for my email list. There's other content at that website, and in the weeks and months to come, there will be some email subscriber only content as a thank you for signing up. Now, in the previous video, and I did a video yesterday, you'll find it on my channel. It's got an identical title, Brandon Sanderson, outline backwards, write forwards, but no short story in the title. But in that video, we talked about Brandon Sanderson and his concept of devising the ending first and then writing forwards towards that ending. And there are numerous writing benefits for that. But after the video was published, I asked myself the following question. Would this concept work for short stories? My gut reaction was that it would. Story is often fractal, and the same elements that you'll find looking at a big overview of a story, as in like a 30,000 foot overview, can also be found if you look at one of the sections of the story, and can even be found sometimes in scenes or sequences. So my gut feeling was that this would be a way that would work to help with generating a short story. However, Brandon is a long-form writer, and I don't know that he's actually ever written much in the way of short stories. Perhaps anyone who's a much bigger fan of his than I am could let me know in the comments. And even for his 2020 BYU course, there was a lecture on short stories, and he got a lady called Mary Robinette Cowell to present on that. Great lecture too. So if you're interested in short stories, you should definitely check that lecture out. It's really good and really helpful. So while I suspected that Brandon's idea of outlining backwards, writing from the ending, however you want to call it, and then writing forwards, the actual way to find out was to go about and do it. So I spent 60 minutes of brainstorming, and with that brainstorming I did a brand new story. One small caveat on that story: I've got a couple of the kind of like detective partners for a dark fantasy detective series that I've already thought about and thought. So I haven't got much in the way of what they do and stuff, but one of those detectives became the main character in this story because it's that kind of thing. It's a dark fantasy mystery story, and I used this process, and I ended up with actually a decent plot skeleton for that dark fantasy mystery crossover story that I just mentioned. So 60 minutes, I went from blank page and first question, and I'll talk about the first question in a minute, and 60 minutes or so later I ended up with a complete structural outline that's still vague enough that there's things to discover in the actual writing process. And the thing that would be great is every session that I'm writing, I'll be writing forward not only to an ending point, which I've devised, which I think works really well for the story, but also there are the waypoints along the way that I'm aiming towards. So there should be, one of the things about doing this kind of process is there should be no decision paralysis. There should be no moments where I'm sat at the computer going, oh no, I don't know where this is going to go. How's this character going to get to there? Most of those decisions, the major decisions, have already been made. So if you imagine it as I've outlined the skeleton of a story, what I need to do now is actually put the flesh on, and there will still be some discovery elements in that fleshing out of the outline structure. But because I'm always going forwards and I always know what the next scene is that we're working towards and the ending point as well, it's going to be an interesting writing process. I won't go into all the specifics of what I did, because what I don't want it to do is actually take away the mental imperative to write the story. And sometimes if you talk about story too much, when you come to write it, it's flat because you've already talked it out. So I won't be giving you any story specifics at this point. There's another reason why, which I'll mention as well. But what I will do is talk about some of the steps along the way, and share an overview of those steps. So step 1, start with the end. So the first thing to do is define the climatic moment. Now, at this point, you don't need to know the plot specifics, but you want to know what the climatic moment is going to be. Is it going to be the detective reveals the murderer tries to get away and gets shot, or is it the audience go, wow, I'll give you a great one, which I don't know, but may have been written by this, but The Sixth Sense, the Bruce Willis film, perhaps when the writer, and his name is M. Night Shyamalan, if I've got your pronunciation wrong, and by any strange chance of coincidence you're watching this, please accept my apologies for mispronunciation. But that moment where Bruce Willis understands that he's a ghost, that's the climatic moment. And maybe he started out with, I want this climatic moment where this character, a massive reveal happens, and not only is it a reveal for the character, it's also a massive reveal for the audience. So that could be the climatic moment definition of, in terms of, you don't know exactly what it will be, but you know exactly what kind of wallop you want it to have. So it doesn't need to be a specific scene, but what you need to have a good understanding of is focusing on the emotional impact readers should take away from that. And once you've decided on the emotional impact, then you can ask, what would make this story memorable? What would go with that emotional impact? So going back to the Sixth Sense example, maybe the writer had gone, oh, I want to have this amazing revelation where the story twists on a single piece of information that's revealed, not just for the audience but for the character as well. How could I do that? And maybe after thinking, he goes, well, what if the guy was a ghost and he's the only one who doesn't know it? And if you watch Sixth Sense again, you'll see all the clues are all there. If you've never watched Sixth Sense, I apologize because I've just screwed the ending up for you. But so you start with the ending. What emotional impact do you want readers to have? And then can you come up with some ideas of how you could actually do that, as in what kind of event? If you listened or watched any of the video resources I mentioned in the previous video on this, Brandon talks about airing on making it as awesome as possible. So start with an awesome ending, and then everything can be built to lead to that awesome ending. So perhaps a better word than memorable would be awesome. So what would make this story awesome? So spend some time thinking about that. Once you've got some idea of the emotional impact you want and what plot stroke character events could deliver that, then you start thinking about the required elements. So character requirements are what growth change must happen. Now, for a short story, not necessarily change focused in the way that longer form fiction is, but there are still things that will affect the character, will affect how the character behaves, how the character behaves going forwards as well. So see if you can jot some thoughts down on what changes are going to happen to the character as they go through the story and get to the point that you've thought about in step 1. Also, plot requirements. Depending on what kind of story type you're using, you can start sketching out what information must be revealed to get to the conclusion you've already talked about. What obstacles will need to be overcome by the character. Often I find when you begin with an ending, there's an implied beginning in that ending. So, for example, I've already said my story is kind of like a supernatural dark fantasy mystery crossover, and I know I came up with the ending and what it would be, and the necessary and most eloquent and efficient start would be that the character, who's the kind of the main character in the story, who's one of these supernatural detectives, has to become involved in this scenario. So from the end, I already had the beginning because that was the most efficient way to do it. So you can also jot some thoughts about what other things must happen along the way for the character, especially if you've got an idea of the beginning to get from start to finish. And also world requirements or world building requirements. What rules, context needs establishing. So if you're writing a traditional short story where there's no supernatural or anything like that, probably any context that needs establishing will pertain to why the character who the story is about is the character most suited to deal with whatever problems need to be overcome, or who is most suited to finding the information that needs to be revealed. If you're writing something like science fiction or fantasy or horror, something like that, something that's got magic or things that are out of the ordinary, you have to work out what the rules of magic are, inverted commas, to quote Brandon, or science if it's science fiction, and what are needed for the story, and what are needed to be fed into the story so the reader doesn't go, well, you cheated me because you just basically, the character won with this Deus Ex Machina ending that came out of nowhere. So if you're writing anything out of the ordinary like that, and the supernatural or magic or anything like that is an important part of the climax, then you need to work out what needs establishing and setting up before you get to that point. You also, and I don't think I've put that down on this slide, can be thinking about what dramatic questions are opened at the start, what questions are opened as the story goes along, and then how are they all closed at the end in the climax, and or is there an epilogue or is there a post-climax scene? So step 3, create the plot skeleton. I worked back from the ending to the start, but I knew the start, as I mentioned in the previous slide, sorry. And there's a story method that I'll probably do a video about at some stage. Screenwriter Jeff Kitchen has written a book where he talks about this. An interesting book. And if you're into collecting story models and pieces of information from story models, it's pretty inexpensive on Kindle, so I would recommend getting it. I'll put a link to what it's called in the description below this video, because it's changed name from when I had it. I bought it originally in the early 2000s, and I think it's changed name since then. Anyway, I'll put that link. But one of the things he has in his book, which I've not seen anyone else talk about, and it works really well for short stories, you start with the ending, as we've been talking about, and then you ask this question: what has to happen so that the scene that creates the ending makes sense? And so then you write that down, and then the next question is, what has to happen so that the scene we just fleshed out or sketched out makes sense? And so you work backwards, scene by scene, asking what needs to be done so that this scene makes sense. What needs to be written so that this scene makes sense? And it's a slightly different way of looking at things. But if you do it, and there are ways of doing it whenever I've done it. So if you've got your end scene, I always go right to left on a piece of butcher's paper. If there are things in the ending that will need setting up, they're not in the immediate scene preceding it, but will be further back. So I draw 2 lines. The scene is there. I sketch out the details on the butcher's paper. And then if there's something that needs to be 10 or 15 scenes back, I'll pencil it in up here, somewhere over here. So this is how I actually worked back. And then when I got what I thought was start to finish, I then looked at it from start to finish, and reordered a couple of scenes, and essentially, I ended up with 5 story beats between the start, the inciting incident, and the climax, the finish, which will give me a strong structural outline for writing this story. Plus, totally unexpectedly, I got a coda epilogue that gives a nice bow to the end of the story. It's like tying off a bow, which up until the end of the process had never crossed my mind, and I really liked the coda epilogue that came up. I thought it gave just a little thematic push to what has happened in the story, plus makes you think that these characters have got things going forwards beyond the story. So that was quite cool as well. Now all I've got to do is write the freaking story. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and write it this weekend. It is, let's have a look. It's Friday the 15th of August. So I'm going to try and write it this morning. I have envisaged 5,000 to 6,000 words, and I'm going to put it in the writing vault that I'm putting together, a resource for writers. More on that in the next slide. But I can't put it until I finished it. As I said, 5,000 to 6,000 words. But the thing that's going to be nice is by outlining and planning it like this, using this process, I've always got strong things to write towards. So I always will know where I'm going. So I think it's going to make the writing process straightforward. So I'm really interested in how this works out. And you can think of the strong ending as the North Star of the story, if you will. You're always heading towards a certain destination. So that will allow, while doing the first draft writing, to plan anything that needs planting in terms of open loops or story questions, because I know where I'm going and I know the main waypoints along the way. So it's been an interesting process so far. So I'm looking forward to writing this. And as I said, this will be the story that goes into the writing vault this month. Now, when I do put it in the vault, I'm not just going to put the story on its own, though. I've got a detailed record of the 60-minute brainstorming process that I went through to get to the point I'm at now. And there's a couple of twists that I've not mentioned, not to the story, to the process, and they'll be in the vault as well. So anyone who's a subscriber to the vault will be able to see that, and they'll get detailed screenshots of the process that I went through, and they'll be able to see exactly how the story was conceived, and they'll be able to they won't be able to access that until they've read the story, but then they'll be able to tie the two together. And what I'm hoping is people will see it and go, whatever the quality of the story, for me, the quality, it'd be great if I produce a good quality story that I can try and put out to a market. But the goal for me is to actually start writing fiction again on a regular basis. And this is the first piece that I'm really going to do that with. And hopefully the people in the vault will see the piece, will see the process that I went through, and be able to see how the two link together. And maybe that will inspire 1 or 2, 5, 10, however many who will get inspired by it to put more of their own stories down on paper, which is what the vault is all about. It's about you finding the resources that you need to start getting more stories down on paper. The URL for the vault is there. There'll be a link in the description. If you've got any questions on this, send me an email, paul@deliberate-practice.com, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you for watching. I hope you found that interesting. The 60 minutes I spent brainstorming were really interesting, and I can't wait to get started on this story and post it in the vault, and hopefully you'll see it there.